So the presidential election has kind of ended at this point. Technically, there's still counting going on in most of the states, if not all of the states, as you have those precincts that are, a little more resistant to quick reporting, all coming in. And I have a lot of thoughts, and I realize this has kind of become my primary platform for conversation about stuff like this, because when I try to talk on other platforms, I often kind of, there's a degree of polarization that a lot of other social media platforms just kind of carry with them, that on YouTube you can kind of transcend. You can kind of push past that. And I do appreciate that. I think it's what makes YouTube such a good platform, at least in the political sphere. But anyways, this is obviously not the result a lot of people wanted. It is the result I can't say that. I wasn't expecting such a big Trump victory. I did expect there to be a pretty significant fright from the Kamala Harris campaign when it comes to turnout. I knew that in terms of battleground voters, those people were going to swing towards Trump, and it was going to lose her the election. That was just reality for me. It's very, very hard to win an election without getting battleground voters on your side. But, I really did find that, the election was a lot more of just a slow, painful death of the Kamala Harris campaign more than anything. It was just every single time you felt like there might be a little hope that we might have some restraint on a prospective Trump presidency. None of that was the case. And we are now probably going to have a Senate and a House that are going to be, I think, very loyal to Trump. I think they're going to be very, on board with what he wants. To start off with talking about him, I do understand people's concerns about him. I do understand their fears with him. I do think there is a level of restraint there, and I'll explain why. I do think that while Trump has never been afraid to say what he thinks, I think he has that businessman mentality coming into all this, and he understands that he can't completely seek absolute power. He can't go dictator on us here. He can't do that, because he understands, I think, that if he tries to do that, it is going to quickly turn pretty much everyone in this country against him. There will be millions of people who he has, soaken into their movement, right? There will be millions of people who support him, but there will be tens of millions, if not hundreds, that will be very against the idea of an extension into totalitarian power in this country. It is one of the biggest things that we stand against in this country. And, I've also firmly believed over the course of the last very few years, ever since the pandemic, that we've seen a pretty significant shift into the libertarian ideology from Republicans. You see a lot of Republicans more willing to kind of ease up on the abortion issue because they recognize they're very much losing that ideological battle right now. You see a lot of Republicans who are focusing more on issues like guns, more on issues like keeping the government out of people's lives. That is really starting to be a big thing among young Republicans. And I do think it's unfortunate that a lot of them have kind of just bowed down to Trump, given his high magnitude of power within the party right now. But, I do think that kind of ideology becoming so prevalent in the party, it is going to make it incredibly difficult for Trump to be able to make that leap from someone where it's like, okay, he can spit out excuses for all of, the things he says and does. But now he is doing something that will be just so blatantly like something bad, right? Because January 6th, the sneaky thing that the Trump campaign and just Trump team in general did with January 6th is they made it out to be a matter of, yeah, there were some extremists that did something kind of bad, but, you got to understand their feelings and, this wasn't as big of a deal as they made it out to be. In the case of an actual attempt to hold on to power, he will find, I think, that it will be incredibly difficult to do so. He will need to fully pack the Supreme Court. He will need to either get rid of those liberal justices, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson, or he will need to overrule their votes, as well as John Roberts and I'd say probably one of the other conservative justices. I do think they have at least 5 justices on the court right now, who are unfortunately very much kind of in Trump's wing. But I do also think that when it comes to the question of things like totalitarianism versus the continuation of our republic, of our, principles of democracy, I do think he would need more power on the court than he does right now. In the case of the executive branch, he will have to ensure that he has loyalists on there, and I do think one of probably the most troubling things that he's planning to do, giving himself the ability to fire anyone in the executive branch, basically just like that. I think, again, that he's doing a lot of things that would allow him to have this option, which is in itself terrible. Do not get me wrong. In itself, giving the president the ability to seemingly in a matter of just a few weeks, really, seize power over both the executive and judicial branches and possibly levy those powers against a legislative branch, or maybe even have legislative power to begin with, because again, in the next 2 years, Trump is going to have probably, the House hasn't been confirmed yet, but the Senate pretty much has, probably going to have both chambers of Congress. So, it's going to be a difficult thing. It's going to be really, really difficult, I think, though, for that to happen. There will be a lot of things that have to happen in order for that to be what I think Trump does. And I think the reason he's not going to do that is because I do think he sees a lot of this as a game to be won. He doesn't really see this as a sort of matter of, medieval world power. I don't really think he comes from the perspective of some of these other 20th century dictators that we saw, where they really were trying to play politics to seek unlimited power. I think Trump, he really just sees this as a win, as a matter of winning or losing. And I think, after watching Johnny Harris's video I don't know if it was a week ago now, but at least several days ago, about Trump, he talked a lot about how Trump, and don't get me wrong, it was very clear who Harris was voting for, but I think Johnny really did a good job at personifying Trump based on what we know about him, based on how he has been raised, more so than how, we've just observed him in his political life, right? Much of his video with Trump was not about his political time in power within the Republican Party. It was on things like, his father, his family, how he was raised. And he very much was raised to be this character that wanted to win at things and saw most of life as a game of winning or losing, and that ultimately winning as the sort of final conclusive goal is the utmost, goal in life. It is the biggest goal in life, to just win at things. And so I think that's why when we look back at Trump's life, he's had a lot of failed business ventures, but a lot of them were because he took a lot of risks. Like he is known to have made a lot of risky endeavors. And, there's a lot of people that will say like, oh, he's actually a failed businessman. And I'm like, okay, that's just unnecessary slander at this point. I mean, the guy, regardless of whether his financial situation is absolutely perfect, he has made a name for himself in the financial community, at least even well before he rode down that escalator and ran for president and is now going to be an 8-year president, right? Well before that, he was known for that kind of, financial, economic superstar mentality. And so, now that he is carrying that into the White House, I do not see him the same way I see some of these dictator characters. I see him as someone who is going to, come 2028, call himself the greatest president the country has ever had. He is going to call himself a winner. He is going to shove it in the Democrats' faces that he beat a female candidate for president 2 times. Maybe not because they're women, but just because the concept of the first female president was something the Democrats really campaigned on, and he'll push that, like, hey, like, I was the one that stopped this, I don't know, that's a little bit more of a stretch than the just, he's going to throw it in everyone's faces. But yeah, I really do see him as more of the just very competitive type. And now that he has won a second term, I think he thinks he's won. I think he thinks that he has gotten the victory. And I think that's part of the reason he rejected 2020 so fervently, because he saw himself after his 2016 victory as someone that was invincible to things like the pandemic, that he was invincible to being, democratically ousted from power, because that is what happens in these presidential elections. And that is what has kind of happened with Joe Biden. He has been just kind of pushed out. But anyways, those are my thoughts on Trump. I don't think he's going to be a dictator. I do think he is going to do a lot of bad things, a lot of things I disagree with, a lot of things that I will, some of them I may even consider to just be morally abhorrent. But now for sort of the main topic of this video, how the election has gone down, because the election frustrated me a lot. And it wasn't even the results of the election that frustrated me. I actually could have seen it as a possibility, right? As a possibility that he was going to come in here and win every battleground state. I didn't personally see that as what was going to happen. I thought Harris was going to win Nevada. I thought it was very likely she would win Michigan. I did not expect her to get less votes in Wisconsin than in Michigan. That appears to be what we may be looking at. The last time I checked, I believe she had 48.8% in Michigan and 48.3% in Wisconsin. She had 48.8%. In Michigan, she had 48.3%. Michigan, to me, was seen as much more of a blue state than Wisconsin. Wisconsin was seen as more of a kingmaker state, where it was like wherever the country really shifted on election night, that was where that state was going to go. And Wisconsin ended up having pretty terrible turnout for Kamala Harris. And I wasn't really surprised, because the Wisconsin polls are historically worse for Democrats than Michigan polls. And what I mean by that is they typically tend to over-predict Democrats more than in Michigan. Michigan's tends to be a little more accurate. And so I think, again, that those things... See, I kind of knew Trump was going to win, and I don't consider this an upset. I consider this kind of a reality that a lot of Americans that do not like Trump have been dreading, but for many of them, they kind of knew it was coming, because polling error has suggested that these razor-thin polls are incredibly deceptive, and the election was bound to go for Trump on election night. When the polls did not shift, election night, obviously, you have that energy. You're like, okay, maybe she could pull off an upset. But to me, the notion of the polls being just drastically more accurate than they were in 2020 was just unfeasible to me, because we had been in the middle of a pandemic. I get how polling may have been affected by that. But, 2016 was also a rough polling year. It overpredicted Hillary by quite a bit. That's part of what, the interesting thing here is that Kamala has arguably had a worse performance in this election than Hillary Clinton, because she's also lost the popular vote, right? The thing about Hillary is that her loss was a shock, right? People did not expect people to just not turn out for Hillary Clinton, right? She did not get the popular vote boost that Joe Biden got in 2020. And, it's a whole nother thing that I might make a video about. It's a whole nother conversation with were those 81 million votes a feasible number for Biden to end up on election night? I absolutely think they were. I feel like, if you're a Republican or a Trumpist and you're criticizing the, 65, 81, 65, like the numbers, how they've dropped back down for Kamala, my feeling would be, okay, but if they rigged it in 2020, wouldn't they also rig it in 2024? And then you'd be like, oh, well, too big to rig. And it's like, yes, but, that still implies they would still be adding to Democrat vote counts. Most of the accusations of fraud are centered around the notion of Democrat ballots being increased and not, Republican ballots being decreased. So in the case of this, if you're saying it was too big to rig, oh man, a lot of what we're seeing this year, it kind of proves how it's just been a matter of political shifts. We had a pandemic in 2020. We had all the reason in the world for 81 million people to go out and vote for Joe Biden, right? Trump wasn't much of a popular president. He hadn't really been his entire first term. I mean, he probably before the pandemic could have pulled off a victory. Just because, again, I think how poor the Democrats have been in recent years at connecting with people, being, attractive to voters. But, I think a big thing that we're seeing is we're seeing how much of an anomaly 2020 was and how Democrats really do need to reconfigure things. So yeah, that's part of it. Immediately as the election results started pouring in and as Pennsylvania was announced and then, Wisconsin was announced and people were like, or actually no, it was Pennsylvania that put them over the edge. But, when Pennsylvania was announced, immediately people are on Instagram, people are on Facebook, people are on Twitter. You can definitely feel the disappointment. And, I at one point posted something on Instagram where I was basically like, yep, we're going to see very similar things to the last few times. Half the country is upset about the election results. Half of it is very happy. And, that was not received well. I had a number of friends of mine that told me it was pathetic to say something like that. And, I was unaware at the time that how I feel about something was something I could be judged for, because it's my personal opinion, right? That things like this, how you feel about it should not be something that should be judged. Maybe what your opinions are on the situation can be judged. Maybe what you view as what's going to happen can be judged. Maybe even how you vote can be conversed about and people can try to convince you. But at the end of the day, this was so much more, at least with the Republicans and the Trumpists in 2020, they just straight up were like, oh yeah, we thought a lot of those votes were fake. They didn't you obviously had your bad apples, but you didn't have, their primary focus was not on criticizing the very people they're trying to get out to vote. That's the problem with Democrats. They have this wide coalition of voters. And then when a bunch of them don't show up, don't, do their duty, suddenly all hell breaks loose, and it's, let's blame the working class voters. Let's blame the middle class voters. Let's blame the family, the family people that didn't feel secure under our administration, right? Hyper-partisan Democrats want to put all the blame of this defeat on anyone but the party. Anyone but the party. Anyone but the party. Anyone but Kamala Harris. Anyone but Tim Walz. Anyone but the campaign staff of the Harris campaign. Anyone. Like, they want to, and the central theme of it all is, oh, well, these are the people that voted Trump in. Well, yes, but a big centerpiece of this, right, is that Trump looks like he got pretty similar 70, to 80-ish million votes compared to 2020, right? He should not have won this election if the Democrats were able to get people out like they did in 2020. And the reality is they didn't just fail to do that. They failed to do that on an astronomical scale. They have failed to do that in some cases. When you take population increases, when you take voting age citizens, right, increases, when you take all the statistics and you look at how, generally speaking, vote numbers are supposed to increase over time, gradually, right? And you look at how similar the popular vote numbers were for the 2016 Hillary Clinton campaign and the 2024, the modern day Kamala Harris campaign, you look at just how absolutely devastatingly bad the Kamala Harris campaign was at getting people out to vote. And car drove by. As I was saying, I am all for, being in favor of certain ideas. I am all for having conversations about that. I am very much not on, I am not in favor of shitting on voters when it comes to how elections go. And, a lot of people, very close friends of mine have said, oh yeah, it's, they're just upset. They'll get over it eventually. And I get that. I do think, perspective wise, that is important. I also think it is kind of shitty how their response to all this anger and upset that they have, is not to detach themselves, is not to take a second and breathe and recalibrate themselves so they can think clearly. It is to go on social media and shit on working class people, on middle class people, on voters, not on the rich, not on, the people that are in these positions of power that ultimately make the decisions that will decide these elections, right? It is not to focus on how can we ensure this won't happen again, that when we have an opportunity to run against a candidate that, a lot of the country doesn't like, right, that we will find someone who will win, right? The focus right now doesn't seem to be on that. It seems to be on, oh my God, I hate 70 million Americans. And it's okay, that's a whole lot of hate, and I'm not trying to sound like one of those very hyper ultra Christian people that kind of really takes the moral principle of love, not hate to an all new radical position where they're you can't even be upset at people. No, I'm not trying to sound like that. I'm trying to say you can be upset that these people voted a certain way, but you shouldn't be shitting on them for it. You should be shitting on the people that had the opportunity to do things that we know, right, would have attracted voters, would have made this election possibly turn out just a little bit better in Kamala Harris's favor. And, instead of doing that, we have decided as a nation that right now our grief should be taken out on the people who voted based on what they were given. And ultimately, we can't change how those people voted. Like, I cannot change the minds of those 70 million Americans. I probably can't even change the minds of 1 million of them, right? Because of what the Kamala Harris campaign left us with. And, I'll explain like what exactly I'm talking about in terms of this, because I recognize that like you can't really shit on the Harris campaign without providing some reasoning. The Democrats in recent years have been incredibly out of touch. They have, every single time there have been big protests, every single time there have been big events, they've seemingly come in here and they've focused entirely on capitalizing on these political issues. They did absolutely nothing about abortion between 2021 and 2023 when they had both the Senate and the House and the presidency, and they had the opportunity to at least try. And it doesn't really seem like they really did it all. I understand that you had senators in the Senate that kind of made the majority seem a little more fictitious than reality, but, there didn't really seem to be much of an effort to even tell people about this. It was ironically the working class people, the middle class people who had to, be the ones to advocate and say, listen, like right now the Biden administration is in a hot place, right? Like they can't get certain things done because of this conservative politician sabotage, right? And we have to, as a nation, come together and say, do we agree that this should be something we should pass? Okay, let's go advocate for our politicians to do this. Because again, at the end of the day, advocacy eventually does make an impact. It may not make an impact that, does much, unfortunately. I think sometimes you do have to dabble in the world of politics in order to make things happen. But we as a country have proven that time and time again, when we have the opportunity to improve, to modernize, to, especially with social issues, get us in better positions, we do eventually consider these things. We do eventually have these conversations, and we do eventually figure out, okay, what's the best way to go forward? Sometimes it's not exactly what you or I want, but it is not, it's not for nothing, right? We do try and we do get things done. And who knows? We don't know what the next 4 years are going to look like. I think that's what really freaks a lot of people out. Not just that Donald Trump is president, but that they don't really feel like they know what's the future for their lives, right? A lot of people feel very socially connected to this election. They feel as though a Trump presidency kind of threatens their well-being. And, I can understand that if you're like, someone that identifies as a member of the LGBTQ community, where, you feel as though you're not going to have certain rights or privileges that you feel as though you're entitled to. And, that those are whole other debates. Those are whole other conversations. Those are things that, conversations we definitely need to have. But for me, a big thing through all of this has been, we can't be looking at the people that voted one way out of two choices, right? Two feasible choices. Anyone who voted third party or voted not at all knew they were throwing away their vote, but they did that because of principles. They did that because they said, both of these candidates do not represent me at all. Both of these candidates I cannot support, right? I cannot actively contribute to those campaigns. And I almost did that. I was at the ballot box and I really thought for a minute, if I don't vote, will I regret it? If I do vote, will I regret it? I did end up voting for Kamala Harris just because I saw myself as just agreeing with her more. And I really had to detach myself from the rhetoric of her supporters and her staunchest allies. I really had to say, like, do I think she would be a decent president? And I was like, all right, I think she'd be better than Donald Trump, a whole lot better. And so I put her down. Might I regret that? Very well. Very easily could end up regretting that. Although I think that's less likely now that she's lost. In the case, though, of like the people who didn't do what I did, they did vote third party or not at all. They know that their vote didn't do much, right? Because of the first past the post system, where you do not have that kind of, you don't really have the ability to vote for third parties because, number one, they don't have the financial capital to become big two-way options, right? It is typically very rare in American politics where we see congressional elections shift to third-party candidates. You usually have to get into the system using one of the two parties, and then you can gradually slip away and try to keep your positions. We've seen two senators in the Northeast, Bernie Sanders and Angus King, successfully do this now for several years. But anyways, they knew what they were doing, and I think that was the point. I think the point was to send a message and say, listen, I don't want Donald Trump to be president. I'm not voting for him. But I also don't want Kamala Harris to be president. I cannot stand for that. And so I really do applaud those people, even as they are some people that I disagree with on political issues, even more than with other liberals, right? Even as I disagree with them so fervently, I do applaud them because they stand on what they believe. And ultimately, they think, I'm sick of this first past the post bullshit. I'm sick of this shit of not feeling like my opinion is valued by the parties, by the politicians, right? Because if it truly was, we would have some push to change the system we have now. We would have some push to allow other parties into the mix of power. We would have some push for it. There wouldn't be nothing like we see now. It is probably the most blatant form of political corruption that we see in modern day society. Just the fact that politicians are not willing to compete against more than the red or the blue. And so, that for me is a big issue. And I know I'm like over a half hour now. Where were we? So for me, I understand those people. I also think, when you look at what happened here, when you look at how people didn't turn out for Kamala Harris, it's like, we have to ask ourselves why. We cannot keep dabbling on this, oh, these are shitty people, right? Because these are people that we will need their support and we will need their votes. This is not a matter of revolution. We understand that violently trying to take back this country is not an ethical option. It is a matter of two wrongs making a right? We recognize right now, at least in our opinions, that what is going on is wrong. But we also recognize that political violence and that actively trying to kill people and in 99% of cases hurting and harming people that are innocent bystanders, we recognize that that is not a price we're willing to pay. Really, in any case, we do not, as a society, value harming others, innocent others, right? We do not value that. And that is why a lot of these BLM protests were unfortunately overshadowed by a lot of the rioting that went on there. And, we unfortunately didn't really have the resources, or didn't really have, reformed police stations necessary that could, figure out new ways to handle these things so that it wasn't a clash between protesters and police. It was a clash between rioters and police, and the protesters would be allowed to continue what they were doing. That's how I see that. But anyways, again, kind of going on these side tangents, but you got to understand it though, because I think a lot of these side political issues, they play right into this election. Any presidential election in our country of over 330 million people is going to be a multivariant issue. As much as I'm saying, things like the economy, things like being out of touch, played right into the hands of Donald Trump and played right into the hands of the Republicans winning this election. I'm also trying to come from a place of there's a lot more than that to this. It's not just that. It's not just that. I am obviously not happy about who has been elected president, just on face value, right? I'm not saying I would have been happy with Kamala. I'm saying I'm not happy with Donald Trump. Our only other option in the system we had this year was Kamala Harris. I would have preferred her. I respect people who would not have preferred her. I recognize that, for people who want to actually have their voice like count for something in terms of who wins, and doesn't just want to kind of, throw away their vote for the sake of kind of taking a stand, which again, I value that, but it's a matter of priorities in this election. If you're one of those people that really felt like, okay, this isn't so bad that I can't it isn't bad enough to the point where I can't vote for either of these people, right? I want to have a say in which way this goes, right? For those people, again, they had two choices, and I get it. You can sing all your praises about Kamala Harris and can sing all of the hatred about Donald Trump that you have, but that is not what America did. I mean, we can't even argue that it was just electoral college bullshit at this point. The country actively voted more so in favor of Trump than Kamala Harris. That is a reality. And we have to look at who was voting here, right? We see so many demographics where Democrats have historically been so good at getting those votes. And over the course of the last few years with Trump, they have disappeared. And they have disappeared because we have made Donald Trump this main character. We have in the news, we have constantly talked about him. We have, in some cases, some of the things that we hate him the most for, right? Or that people just strongly dislike him the most. I don't like to use the term hate, but I strongly dislike the guy, right? Some of these things, some of these reasonings why people dislike him the most are actually the reasonings why he's gotten so much power. Because people see this guy as the main character. They see him as somebody where it's like, if you can sympathize with this guy, right, and you can feel like, hey, these people are all against him, everybody's up against him. If you can believe that to some degree, you can vote for him. You can also vote for him if you just don't like the Democrats enough. And I hate to tell you, but in a lot of cases, things like abortion and things like, abortion and, a lot of these other issues, social issues, they were not the priorities of this election. The two priorities on election night that we saw were the state of our country and the economy, both of which the Democrats are incumbents with right now, and both of which a lot of Americans really don't like the Democrats with. I think I think the state of the country really helped this not be a total annihilation, right? It prevented a 1984 situation, but you still had the economy, and that was enough to make not just Donald Trump win, but also some more Republican. I'm pretty sure they just called Pennsylvania for Dave McCormick. Dave McCormick, he was not expected to beat Bob Casey. He was not seen as a strong character against Bob Casey, right? I think Jackie Rosen is winning now. Some of these top characters in terms of Democratic senators, these characters that really did seem like they were giving the Democrats a chance at keeping the Senate majority this year, right? Sherrod Brown, John Tester, them two, they lost, right? Colin Allred's campaign that people thought was going to bring Texas close got lost pretty strongly, right? North Carolina came pretty close, but even then, Trump still won the state, even as the Republican candidate for governor had just one of the biggest downfalls we've seen in recent years in terms of his campaign. It was just a matter of he's not going to win anymore. It doesn't even matter that Trump is winning the state. He's not going to win, Tammy Baldwin and Alyssa Slotkin looked pretty like they could lose, right? Tammy Baldwin was a big scare. If Jackie Rosen wins, she will still have been a really big scare. Even Kari Lake is getting a lot of votes in Arizona, considering how I thought she was going to do. Trumpism has made a dramatic comeback from 2020 and 2022. That's a fact to me. And that is a very scary fact. And it is a testament to how much failure I feel as though the Democrats have allowed to occur, right? People that we know will probably not do a whole great job in the positions they're being given, are being given those positions because the Democrats managed to make themselves more unlikable in the span of the last 4 years. Say what you want about how good Joe Biden was, right? And with a lot of your points, I'll agree with you, but the fact of the matter is that they failed where it matters most, and that's connecting with the people, getting in touch with the people, being people that you felt like you were connected to. And here in New York, that was not the reality for our New York politicians. Pat Ryan won. Josh Riley won. Mondaire Jones didn't really come close to winning, but he was a character, again, that was more progressive, right? Mark Molinaro lost his House seat, which was astonishing to me. And again, none of these results are technically confirmed, but there's a strong consensus that they're going to be that they are going to be the thing that we determine has happened. All I can say is, like, we had a lot of good Democrats where I'm from in New York. I had a lot of Democratic local politicians, Dee Dee Barrett, Michelle Hinchy, who were able to earn my vote in one way or another, right? And at the national stage, they didn't do that. I do primarily blame them. And I do think until they tell people to stop blaming working class voters, I will continue to be very, very restrained with how much I support the Democratic Party. And that's how I'll finish this off.